Jesus and his disciples were on their way to Caesarea Philippi when he asks these very probing questions. I would suggest that Jesus and his disciples, who do not live in Caesarea Philippi, but live in Clifton, Finneytown, the west side, St. Bernard, disciples who live in Mason, Ludlow, Kentucky, who live in Villa Hills, who live in Spring Grove Village, who live in Newport, disciples who live on Riverside, disciples who live in all these different neighborhoods of Cincinnati represented here this morning. Jesus still asks the question, who do people say that I am? We could, from our Catholic training, especially those of us who are old enough to have sort of a catechism background, we could answer, oh, you are the second person of the Blessed Trinity. That doesn't tell me a whole lot. We might say you are the Son of God. You are the Messiah. Or we might say with Peter, you are the Christ. But like Peter, do we really know what we're saying when we give that answer? Do we know what that means? Peter did not fully understand, of course, when he gave that great testimony of faith, you are Christ. Because when Jesus began to explain who the Christ is and what the Christ will be, talking about suffering and being handed over to death and dying on a cross, rising on the third day, Peter wanted to hear nothing of that. That's not what he wanted his Christ to be. So Peter has the nerve to rebuke Jesus. Jesus turns around and rebukes Peter. In fact, as you heard, he says, "Get out of my sight, Satan. You're being the tempter. I need you not to think like human beings think, but to think as God thinks." One of the brothers who lives here in the house said to me, I think it was this week, when we had some similar passage about you need to think as God thinks, not as human beings do. He's like, but we are human beings. Isn't that a lot to ask? To ask us to think like God? It is. And who of us can think like God? And yet, Paul says in the letter to the Philippians, we are to put on the mind of Christ. Somehow we are to try to live into the mind of Christ and make life decisions as we feel directed by this relationship with Jesus, who is the Christ. St. Paul, in the second reading, well, not St. Paul, James, in the reading we heard today, the second reading, says if you're going to live as Christ, then you're not just going to say words of faith, but you're going to put that faith into action, into loving deeds. It's not enough for us when this homily ends to stand together and profess, I believe in one God, Father Almighty, Creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus. I believe in the Holy Spirit. It's not enough for us to just say those words. But somehow we have to take those words, take them to heart, and do the best we can put our faith into action. Faith without works is void. It's pretty useless. Someone can talk about their deep faith, but we need to see some evidence of faith shining forth in people's lives, in our lives. So what do we do in the face of ugly? There's a lot of things in the world that can be rather ugly. Do we insist on seeing beauty and maybe helping create and bring beauty into what seems like an ugly situation? Sometimes the ugly is words that are thrown about. How do I respond as a disciple of Jesus with the mind of Christ? How do I respond to ugly words? If I think like humans, I might push back on my own. But if I'm trying to think like Christ, I'm trying to bring peace. I'm trying to bring goodness. Maybe sometimes all I can say to somebody who goes on and on with some diatribe about something is, peace, my sister, peace. I may not need to argue with them at all, but just peace, chill, or whatever the word might be in the moment. Somehow, as disciples of Jesus, we do need to meet the needs of those that present their needs to us. Sometimes it is food. Sometimes it is other necessities of life. You individually may not be able to meet the needs of every person who approaches you, but somehow we do try from time to time through a place like St. Anthony Center, food pantry, by supporting such things. There are ways that we are putting our faith into actions. Who Jesus is does make all the difference. Who you believe God is. If you believe, as we do in our Franciscan perspective, that ultimately God is love, that God is beauty itself, if that's ultimately what we believe of God, then we act as somebody who believes that there is beauty, and there is goodness, and there is love in the world. And we as disciples of Jesus are charged with somehow trying to bring a little bit more of that into the world around us, into whatever city, whatever neighborhood. I don't know where Caesarea Philippi is, but I know where the places are that we all live. And that's where we are called to be the disciples of Jesus. To the best of our ability, with the mind of Christ, extent that any one of us can know that. Going back over and over again to the gospel, rediscovering the Jesus of the Gospels. That's the most important thing I think we can do. I was talking to somebody yesterday who reminded me that in the old Mass, the Tridentine rite, some people are kind of enthralled by that again, that almost every Mass was a Mass for the dead. And I didn't remember this, that every one of those Masses had the same Gospel and the same Epistle. So you never heard the fullness of the Bible. We never heard the fullness of the Gospel. We need to look at the Gospels. We need to look at what did Jesus say? What did he do? Not what theologians said about him through 2,000 years of theologizing, but just go back over and over again. What did Jesus do? What did he say? He didn't say there will be no suffering in your life. He had plenty of it in his own. It's not going to be a life without suffering. I read something that said, if being Catholic is easy and is costing you little, you're doing it wrong. There was another phrase in there, but you get it. If you think being a Catholic is an easy thing to be, you're getting it wrong. It's supposed to be a challenge. It's supposed to be calling more and more forth from us on a day-to-day basis. So the question Jesus poses in the gospel, he poses to me, poses to you. Who do you say I am? Who am I to you? And then, what follows from that? What does our following of Jesus supposed to look like?